Phil here from Numerically Tanked, and today I'm going to show you how I painted this Night Lord's Tactical Marine for the Horus Heresy of Games Workshop. Let's get started. For the deep midnight blue of the Night Lord's armor, I started off with a white pre-highlight over a black undercoat using Media Comart Opaque White. Even though this model will eventually be fairly dark, I start with this white highlight step to begin to sketch out the volumes of the armor and to provide a good starting point for the blues I'm going to layer on next. It is also important to note here that this pre-highlight is not a zenithal highlight, as I'm trying to capture some of the reflected light from the ground as opposed to just a top-down light source. Generally speaking, when people are taught about zenithal highlights, they are taught to only spray the highlight from the top of the model as if there were a single point of light from above. And while I'm not going to get into the weeds about how light is supposed to work in the real world, in short, some of the light from above will actually bounce off of the ground and reflect back up and hit the lower parts of the armor. Because of this, I'll make sure that I highlight both the inside and outside of the legs here, as otherwise the model won't look quite right. After the pre-highlight, I layer on 2 thin coats of Telsa Blue from scale 75. I keep my paints fairly thin here, as to not obscure the pre-highlights from the previous step, because otherwise, if they were too thick and opaque, you would lose the volumes you gained before. Next up, I push the highlights on the model a bit further with a mix of 50-50 Tesla Blue and Caribbean Blue, also from scale 75. This highlight is focused on the same areas I hit with the white pre-highlight before. Now you might be wondering at this point, why am I going so bright with my blues here, if the goal is to get a deep and dark midnight blue? And this is because I personally prefer to go pretty light with my initial paint layers, and then tone down the color with a series of inks later on. For my paint style, I really enjoy using inks over an overly highlighted acrylic paint layer for a couple of reasons. The first is that because the inks are so thin, they shoot through an airbrush very easily and don't really clog it up the same way that acrylic paints might. Acrylic inks are also extremely pigmented and leave a nice, rich, and vibrant color. I actually find that I can get a much more saturated color scheme using inks over acrylics than acrylics by themselves, especially with scale 75 paints that I use frequently, as they are generally more desaturated and matte. For this model, I started off with 2 thin layers of watered down intensity blue from scale 75. This ink is especially intense, I guess, so you need to thin it down with about 20 to 1 parts thinner to ink. After these 2 all over layers of blue ink, add another drop of the blue ink to my mixture and add some more targeted shading to the parts that we left black in the initial pre-highlight. Finally, in order to really push the shadows deeper, I had a single drop of scale 75 intensity violet and did 1 more layer on the deepest shadows. After the inks dried, I added a final layer of thinned down gloss varnish over the entire model. Next, I jumped straight into the oil stage for this marine. This is a bit out of my normal order of painting marines, but I did this because I'm going to use the oil stage to add further contrast to the blue, which I did by mixing in some purple oil paint with the black oil wash I normally use. If, however, I did the decal and metal steps prior to this oil wash, they would potentially get tinted purple, which I did not want. This purple was a bit of an experimental choice, as I don't normally use colored oil paint on my miniatures, but I think it turned out pretty well, and I definitely want to use more colored oils in my future other than the traditional burnt umber and black that everyone seems to use. If you're following along, though, and do not like the slightly purple tint this oil wash gives to the model, you absolutely can use either a pure black oil wash here, or do something experimental of your own with some blue oils. I applied this oil wash pretty heavily with a brush, as again, I am looking to tint the entire model a bit darker. Once the oils were dry, I used a makeup remover sponge to gently wipe away the oils. I focused on the areas of the armor that would be the most highlighted, such as the top of the head and shoulder pads. One of the really cool things with oil paints that you can do is you can choose to wipe away as much or as little as you want by modulating the pressure you apply with a makeup remover or by doing multiple passes with the sponge. For example, I wanted to make sure that the top of the head was one of the most highlighted areas on the model, so I did 3 or 4 passes with the sponge to get the coloration back up to the blue it was prior to the oil wash. If you do decide to do multiple passes though, make sure you use a new sponge each time. Otherwise, you'll just be depositing the oils you wiped away previously back onto the model. Finally, I sprayed the marine with a layer of thinned down Vallejo gloss varnish to lock in the oils. I used gloss here because I still need to add decals to this model, and decals go on much better over gloss varnish than anything else. If the decals were already on, however, I would go right into matte varnish at this step. There is not a ton of interesting work going on with the decals on this model, as I just put the Night Lord's chapter badge on one shoulder pad and a tactical squad marking on the other. I did, however, add some free-handed lightning bolts to the lower leg by painting small random zigzag patterns. This is not hard to do as long as you thin down your paints with a little bit of ink. In this case, I use Scale 75 Arctic Blue thinned down with white ink. The ink acts as a thinning agent here, but unlike water, it doesn't dilute down your paint's pigmentation, so the paint will flow easily off the brush but still be opaque and provide good coverage. I also glazed down the lightning bolts with some thinned down Intensity Blue and rehighlight them with pure white ink. This step is probably unnecessary for general rank and file troops, but I did it so that the lightning would have a little more color variance into it and look more interesting. I next apply a layer of matte varnish to kill off all the shine from the previous gloss varnish steps. For the shoulder pad trims, I first start with a layer of black metal from Scale 75, and then do a rough highlight of heavy metal, also by Scale 75. For all of the cabling and ribbing on the model, I simply painted it first with a layer of Scale 75 heavy metal, and then washed it with known oil from Games Workshop. This is a really easy process, but looks good enough, and is really helpful for getting a lot of models done quickly. I decided to keep the weathering on this model fairly light, and this was mainly because my normal step of using Rhinox hide would be far too dark on this dark blue armor and wouldn't really stand out. So instead, I decided to just lightly chip the edges of the armor with heavy metal from Scale 75. For the parts of the armor where the sponge won't easily reach, I put a little bit of heavy metal on my brush and gently dab on some paint to the edges to represent the chipped armor. For the eyes, I of course had to do the iconic Night Lord red eyes. I started by painting the eye lenses with speed metal from Scale 75, and then used Carenberg Crimson Shade by Games Workshop to get the deep crimson color I was going for. For the bolt gun casing, I first painted it with flat black from Scale 75, and then highlighted the edges with anthracite gray, also from Scale 75. All that's left now is to attach the model to the base. For this Night Lord, I decided to use a frozen Arctic Tundra base as I thought that the white snow of the base would complement the dark blue of the Night Lord's armor and make the mini pop. I also added a tiny bit of snow effects to my model's lower legs, simply to tie the model into the base. I have found that the small details such as this really help to make your model feel like they're actually in the environment your base represents, as opposed to just standing on top of it. If you'd like to know how I made this base, please check out the link in the upper right hand corner above. With that, the model's done. Do you have any upcoming Night Lords projects that you might use this scheme on? If so, let me know in the comments below. Also, if you liked the video, please subscribe if you want to help me screw with YouTube's algorithm and trick other people into viewing my content. Thanks for watching, and hobby on.